What do I think about learning different Qigong practices and doing those Qigong practices from different Qigong styles or different schools? That is going to be the topic of this episode of Qi Life. So there are some Qigong teachers out there. I think it's probably getting to be less and less these days because a lot is changing. It's actually changing quite rapidly in terms of, so not Qigong itself, like those principles are staying the same, but in terms of the Qigong community, the general environment. Because in the past, as I've mentioned before in other vlogs, there used to be a lot of secrecy around Qigong. It was held quite closely. People were very careful who they taught, and they didn't want other people learning things, all that sort of thing. And that's changing a lot. The world is so connected. There's not really the same reasons for being secretive about different Qigong practices anymore, and so there's so much more that we can learn easily, very openly. And I think that's a really, really good thing. But because of that history of secrecy, and it's partly to do with the secrecy, it's not just the secrecy itself, there's some other dynamics there as well. There were a lot of Qigong teachers who just absolutely did not want anyone also practicing Qigong from someone else at the same time as they were practicing their Qigong. And there's more than one reason for that, and some of them are somewhat valid. Some of it is just about power dynamics. People wanting to essentially be in control of someone else and go like, well, if you go and do something else, I'm not going to teach you anymore, sort of thing, and sort of to be the one source of truth, so that they'd only listen to them, and that's not healthy. I don't think that's valid at all. Some of the more valid reasons why some Qigong teachers, and again, some still say this, but less and less. Some more valid reasons why they would sometimes say, hey, don't learn any other Qigong practices, is because different Qigong practices will sometimes be operating using different principles. Now, the underlying principles, right deep behind Qigong, it's going to be the same, right? But they can be applied in different ways, and different things more to the fore, and in doing that, if someone's focusing on one particular type of Qigong practice using principles in a certain way, and then they mix that with another type of Qigong from somewhere else, these two things could conflict with each other. They may not mix harmoniously, particularly if whoever it is who's doing those practices doesn't have a full understanding of what they're doing. And again, unfortunately, often in the past, a lot of teachers were pretty reticent about actually explaining the principles behind the Qigong practices that they're doing. Again, either sometimes because they just didn't know. Other times, they didn't know for themselves, so they couldn't teach someone else. Other times, again, as a way of maintaining control, influence over their students. And other times there were other reasons as well, to allow it to be a slow process of discovery for the student, and that leads to a different learning experience and so on. But yeah, they were often very slow to actually explain the principles, and so it was very common for someone to be doing a practice and not really know what they're doing and what principles behind it. And then if they then add in another practice that they also don't understand what principles are at play and what's going on, yeah, there could be some conflict there, which could lead to, a lot of the time it's not going to have too harmful an effect, but in a edge case scenario, if they're like very strong focused practices, they could have some quite harmful effects mixing those things together. And even quite aside from harmful effects, again, particularly in this sort of situation where someone's following some practices, not really understanding what they're doing, but just doing what their teacher has told them, I guess with a certain degree of faith and so on, and trying to cultivate a skill with the energy in a certain way, again, not understanding what they're doing, even if it's not so much going to give harmful effects, it may slow down that process, it may interfere with it a bit. And so, yeah, so that's a valid reason for not wanting people to do other Qigong practices, alongside the ones from your school or your system. Now, that's valid within a context. It's valid within a certain type of learning, where maybe the principles aren't explained properly or so on. When you really understand the principles behind a practice, a lot of those issues go away, because you're then able to judge whether, with one practice that you're doing, whether some other practices will fit harmoniously with them, whether they may even assist and help the process that you're working with, or whether they may conflict. But that comes from really understanding those principles well that go behind the practices. And I suppose even these days that's not super common. But again, I think it's probably becoming more and more common. I think as Qigong is being taught more and more openly and widely, there are more and more teachers who are teaching in a really solid, grounded way, where they're really teaching the principles well, so that they're setting their students up well to really understand what they're doing and be able to benefit from it. In that context, learning and doing practices from different schools and systems can be really beneficial. It can be really, really good for a few different reasons. One being that, well, it actually just gives you more variety, which can be enjoyable. And another reason being, within a single school, within a single Qigong style or system, there's actually no way that can teach you absolutely everything about Qigong. Now, it can teach you a lot, and it may teach you everything that you personally need, and maybe many people personally need, because, a single style can include a lot. The Long White Cloud Qigong my school, we teach a lot of different practices. It covers a lot of different things. And for a lot of people, that's going to be plenty. They don't really need to look for anything else. But at the same time, sometimes that can be just enjoyable, like, something different. And particularly because within a particular school and style, there's often, while you might focus on different practices with quite different principles behind them, even within the same school as developing different skills, there's always going to be a certain flavor, a certain approach that connects all of those practices together, which is a good thing. It means that it's going to be easier to understand how they all fit together, harmonize them together, and so on, because there's this similar thought process, similar methodology, even if it's working with different principles in there. But there's so much more to experience sometimes as well. And again, many people might be satisfied perfectly fine just working with the practices from one school, but it can be interesting to experience practices that have come from a different source, that have a different flavor to them, you could put it. And sometimes that's simply interesting. You might try some of those other flavors and go, actually, interesting, but not for me. Other times, experiencing those other practices you might find something you really like, and you might want to, I'm going to continue with that practice. I love it. Or, as well as that, it may even give you some new perspectives on the other practices that you've already learnt, maybe within a school, that actually helps you to understand them better, because you're just seeing some things from a different perspective. And there's no way you'd get that within the one school, because you're just like, it's all got this similar thought process, is one way to put it, or methodology behind it. But you see a practice which has some different components there. It's like, new perspective on what you've already learned. And so that can be really healthy. That can actually really contribute to your overall understanding of Qigong and what you get from the practice, both in terms of tangible benefits and simply enjoyment. Now, having said that, there are some principles I think that you should still follow in terms of not mixing practices. And the biggest one is one that I've already made reference to, and that is to make sure you understand the principles of any practices that you're doing before you combine them together in any way or even practice them alongside each other. Now, naturally, you're not going to understand all of the principles of some new practice that you start to learn because you're just starting, right? And so a way that often you can do this if you're wanting to learn something new is by, well, one is put aside the practices that you've been doing for a period of time. It doesn't mean you're never going to do them again, but put them aside for a while so that you're not going to mix together different ways that the practices work while you're focusing on them, and spend some time just focusing on that new practice until you start to understand those principles. And then when you start to understand them well, then you can start to practice them together again. And that might not necessarily mean like, just mixing them all up together, but maybe practicing them, within the same day at different times, or even practicing them. And look, if they're gentle practices, often, even if you don't understand the principles well, just doing them at different times of the day is going to be fine. And so you're like creating a little bit of separation between them. Or even actually within the same session, once you understand the principles well, and you can see like, hey, I see how what I'm doing in this practice would harmonize or work along with this other practice as well. So yeah, something I think you'll find is, so yeah, I'm very open to people learning different practices from different styles, different schools. In fact, I encourage it, but I do think it's quite important and valuable to make sure you focus on whatever practices you're doing, and really understand them well first before you then look at other things. So I do suggest, for the most part, that people put aside any other practices while they're focusing on something new. Sometimes if it's a very gentle practice, it's like, yeah, okay, you can do those alongside each other, but generally it's best to keep them separate until you understand what you're doing. And so because of this, you'll find actually amongst the many long white cloud Qigong instructors that there are around the world, that quite a few of them actually, you might find a few if you go to their classes or things like that they teach a lot of long white cloud Qigong practices, of course, because they've done training and they love those practices and teach them. But they might also sometimes teach some other practices that aren't long white cloud Qigong, but they've gone out and studied and learnt some other ones as well, and they've come to understand them and then brought that into their practice and into their teaching as well. And that's a healthy thing. Of course, that's then not strictly speaking long white cloud Qigong, but there's no reason why someone shouldn't combine together different practices if they have studied them well enough to understand them properly. And that's something that I always really focus on within the long white cloud Qigong courses, is really teaching the principles behind the practices. So not just to remember some movements but to really understand what you're doing. And so people who graduate from those courses understand the principles behind the long white cloud Qigong practices, for sure, the ones that they've studied, but that often also puts them in a really good position to more readily understand the principles behind other practices that they might work with as well. All right, so those are my little thoughts on what I think about learning different Qigong practices from different styles or different schools. Hopefully that's been interesting, maybe, giving you some food for thought. I look forward to seeing you on the next vlog soon.